Hey everybody, welcome to part 2 of our introduction to Backbone video. Sorry for the long awaited part 2, but I finally found the time to actually do this. So without any further ado, let's take a look at what we'll be covering. We'll be taking a look at the sync function, then we'll go over the routes, and we'll finish it off with the history API. So as you can see, I already have the project that we created last time open. And what we'll need to do is we'll need to switch to the console to create a new Express project based on that. To do that, we'll just type express --egs to use the embedded JavaScript instead of using the default Jade. What Jade is, if you don't know, it's a similar templating engine to Haml in syntax. And we won't use it just to keep things simple. We'll use EGS, which is a lot closer to just normal plain HTML. But I do suggest you take a look at it when you have time. So next we'll just type in our project name. So that's going to be Backbone Twitter part 2. Click enter and we'll say yes, we want to write in new files even though the destination is not empty. And that'll create a whole bunch of folders here in the background for us. And we can start by modifying our project to use the new files that Express gives us to run them from Express instead of using the static JS file that I used previously. So we can delete that one and we can look in our index and grab the index, delete that and add that to the view. Next, we will need to grab all the JavaScript that we have and drop it down into a single file. So let's do that. There we go. And we'll just save it to the JavaScript folder under the name main.js. And let's create a new file with that name. And close this. So the next thing we will need to do is we will need to change the way we render our templates, our client-side templates, so it doesn't interfere with the way that EGS interprets the templates, because EGS uses the same delimiters as our client-side templating, so we need to use different delimiters for client-side templating so it doesn't conflict. So we're going to change these to use double color brackets like so. Okay, and these ones, perfect. There we go. So to use those new delimiters, we'll have to put in some code to notify underscores templating engine that we want to use different delimiters. And you can find that actually in the underscore documentations over here. So we're just going to copy and paste this code and put it right at the top over here. So just like that. And that should do it. Now we can actually test out that our application is working. So let's do it by cding into the new projects that we just created. So Backbone Twitter part 2. Let's npm install all the dependencies that Express needs. So there we go, we're done with that. And then let's just run a node app. And that's going to start our server. So back in our browser, we can actually go to port 3000 and take a look at what it gives us. Perfect. So it gives us the same application that we had before. So let's test it out to make sure that everything's working. So Neo, hello everyone. And the last thing we need to do before we can test it is just to add the files for underscore and Backbone. So I'm just going to add them over here. Okay, so I've just added the two files here. So I added Backbone underscore under the vendors directory in the JavaScript folder. And all we need to do now is we need to change our view to reflect that. So let's do that. So JavaScript vendor and the same thing just right here. Okay, perfect. Now we can save that and we can switch to our console to install our npm dependencies for Express. So now that that's done, and I've done it before, we can just go and type node app to start our application. And we can switch to our browser now to take a look at what that looks like. So let's refresh the page. Okay, everything looks like it loaded normally. Now let's just test out that we can still send a tweet. Okay, there we go, perfect. So we can send a tweet, we can edit a tweet, and we can delete a tweet, just like we were able to do before. Perfect. Now, we will need to actually connect to our MongoDB. And to do that, we're going to use something called Mongolian. Mongolian is just a wrapper for MongoDB native driver, which makes it just a little bit nicer. And out of all the other ones that are available, there are a few more. Comes in mind is Mongoose right now. The reason I didn't use Mongoose is because I felt it was a little too complicated here, and I just don't like the way that Mongoose handles errors and a few other things in the Mongoose API itself. So we'll just stick to this for now, and you feel free to choose your own one. Back in our console, and we're going to npm install Mongolian. And instead of using just npm install, we're actually going to use the save flag, so it saves it as part of the package.json. So over here in the package.json, we can see Mongolian was added to our dependencies list. And that's going to help other developers when they run npm install, and it's going to install all those dependencies. So that's perfect. Okay, next up, we'll create a new file. Database just in the root of our application. So let's call it database.js. And what database.js is going to do is going to use the Mongolian API. So we're going to start by requiring Mongolian, and then we're going to create a new server. So new Mongolian, and we're going to create a new database on that server. And we're just gonna export the collection. So to access our collection, we're gonna go db.collection, and we're gonna use a new collection called tweets. Mongo.db creates a new collection as soon as you try to use it. So that's what we're gonna do. And that's so that we can actually use it in other files. We're going to export this as an array of collections, so, or better yet, an object literal of collection, and we're just going to call this one tweets. So now we can access collections.tweets every time we include the database file. Back in our application, we're going to require our new database file. So db equals, here we go. So now that we've done that, let's test out our database connection just by console logging the collection we just exported. So let's just say tweets and just print out the tweets. So db.collections.tweets. There you go. And let's restart our application to see that it actually worked. Looks like we have a syntax error here, and let's just remove that semicolon here, and that should do it. And there we go, we printed out the new collection over here, as you can see. So that completes our database connection. Next up, we will need to create a RESTful resource for the Backbone Sync API to be able to synchronize the client-side resource with the server-side resource. So it's very similar to the way that Rails does RESTful resources. So we're going to follow the same template. We're going to start off by making a few modifications to the default template that comes with Express. So instead of using the routes.index file, we're just going to have a more Railsy way of doing things with routes.js. So we're going to refactor this file into routes.js instead of having per controller, which is usually not needed. So let's just do that. There we go. There you go. And we can delete this file now. Perfect. So we're going to modify our app.js file to use our new routes file. And we're just going to modify our app.js file to include our new routes file and use that instead of using this line here where we define the routes in our app.js. We will instead define them in routes.js. So to do that, we'll just require routes, and we're going to pass in the app, and we can take this and put it down in the routes now. Now, instead of using a normal export, we're going to wrap So instead of using a normal export, we're going to use module that exports and define it as a function that gets an app variable. And that's what we're gonna do to actually define our routes. So let's grab that. Now we're going to move this here into a controller. So we're going to call this the home controller. And we're also going to create a new resource for tweets under the path tweets in a restful manner. So let's first create a new controller home. So as you can see, we don't have a controllers directory here. So we're going to first create that. So controllers, and under controllers, we're going to create the home controller. And we can just tweak this a little bit. Perfect. Okay, now we'll need to include our new controller. So let's call it home.index. And let's include our new home controller. There we go, just like that. I'll just make sure that everything still works. We'll need to restart our Node application to do that. So it's telling us that the home controller is not there just because it is called home controller, not just home. And we can again restart our application. And that's because our home controller is not this. So now we can try it again. And I just noticed that I misspelled controller, so let's rename that with the proper spelling. So controller, there we go. So now we can restart our application and that should work. So let's take a look at what we get in the browser. Exactly the same thing. Seems to work. Excellent, just like we expect. So back in the routes file, we would want to create a new RESTful resource for tweet. So let's do that. And I'm just going to paste in some code here that's going to do that for me. We'll just want to import the tweets controller that we're about to create. So let's do it over here, just like that. Perfect. And let's just go over the code before we create that controller. So over here, we're just defining the normal RESTful routes that you're probably accustomed to from other applications. So we have our index action, and then we have our CRUD operations. So I should probably move this. So we have our create, we have our show, which is our read, update, and we have our destroy. So now let's go ahead and create a new controller for our tweets and call that file tweets controller. Now let's create all the different actions in this controller just by defining some stubs for them. There we go. So this will be our show, create, destroy, and update. Now let's start off by defining our index action. That's going to be very simple. We're just going to use our tweets collection, the database. So we're going to first include the database, and we're going to find all the tweets and turn them into an array and echo it back to the requester. If there's an error, we're just going to return a 500 error back from our controller and send it a status of failed to find tweets. Otherwise, we're just going to send the docs that we find. So each, if you're not familiar with the terminology, each one of the records in a MongoDB database and a NoSQL database is called a document, and there's a collection which is similar to a table in a SQL database. So that's going to be our index action, and our create action is going to be also very simple. We're just going to create a new tweet based on the body. And now we're just going to define the create action, and we're going to hook it up from the client side right after we create this one. So let's do that. So we'll create a new tweet, and we'll assign the request body parameters to that new tweet. So we're going to define a new params variable, and we're going to use the body, whatever is posted to the body, to create a new tweet. Since the create action is a post, so we have to use the request.body instead of using the request params. So we're going to insert that into our database using the params, and we're going to define a callback. So I'm going to give it an error. So if it's an error, again, we're going to return a status 500. So it failed to create a new tweet. That's good. And if it's successful, we're just going to send back the request params to the client. That finishes off our create action. Now on the client side, we have to actually hook it up. So back here in the client side, all we need to do really is to save our new tweet down here after we add it. We need to save it on the server side. Simple as calling tweet.save, passing it an empty hash for the attributes that have changed because we've already defined them up here. And then we're just gonna pass a success and error callback functions, which are going to be called if it successfully saves, or if there's an error, then it's going to call the error one. So when we return our 500 error messages, that's when the error callback is going to be called. So for now, let's just console log the results. Let's console log successfully saved tweets. And for the error, let's just do the same thing. Error saving tweets. There we go. So just like that. And that's almost it. So one more thing we'll need to do before saving the tweets model, we'll need to specify the URL in the tweets collection that's associated with the tweet. So just down here where we define our collection, we can define a URL. Okay, and that should do it. So we can now restart our application and we can go back to our browser, reload the page, and let's give it a try. So Neo, hello there. Post that. Perfect. So as you can see, the tweet has been successfully saved. And if we switch back to our console and we actually check in our Mongo collection, so we can list all the available collections in the show DBs command. So there we go. We have our Backbone tutorial. So we can use Backbone tutorial, and we can list all the available collections just by doing show collections. Perfect. So I have the tweets collection there created. Now we'll just need to do db.tweets.find, and that'll find all the tweets that are available. So there we go. We have this new tweet right here at the bottom, just like we expect. Neo, and there our tweets. Perfect. So we just saved our data to a database. Next, we'll need to actually list our data that's coming from the server back in our Backbone application here. Backbone doesn't know anything about the data that the server gets back in our controller here. If we look back at our tweets controller, you can see we send it the doc on the index action here. And if we go to that in our browser, so if we go tweets, we can see a JSON collection with all the tweets available to us. Now, to show all the tweets in our applications, all we need to do is bootstrap our Backbone with all the data from the server. And the way we'll do it is by going back to our editor, and just down here where we're rendering the tweets view and the initializer, just down here, we're going to fetch all the tweets from the server. And what that will do is it will populate all the tweets in the tweets collection that we have up here based on this URL tweets. So down here, we just say tweets.fetch, and we'll again give it success and error function. I just want to render the view itself again and do nothing else. So let's define self up here. Perfect. And on error, I just want to console log that. There we go. Perfect. Now we can just make it a little more condensed just by doing this. There you go. And let's test it out. Let's see if it actually worked. We don't need to restart the server here just because we only made changes to the client side and already have the console here open with the cache flag disabled in Chrome. So it's going to reload it from the server, and it's not going to receive a cache version. So we can just reload it and things will just work. Perfect. So we see all the tweets from our database. So how does this all work? So let's roll back a little bit and take a look at what we've actually done with the save and the fetch here. So we have the fetch over here, and then we have the save when we add the tweet. So the way this works is it uses the collection URL. So Backbone looks at the tweet model, and if the tweet model is part of a collection, which it maintains a reference to, and it is, in our case, it's part of the tweets list collection, and the tweets list has a URL, it will use that URL. And that's all defined in the sync function that I told you I would show you. So let's take a quick sneak peek. Okay, so down here in the sync function, we can see that the URL is being retrieved from the model. And if we actually take a look at how the URL in the model is being retrieved, we'll see that it uses the collections URL if it is defined, or it uses the model URL if that's defined. So the model URL will take preference over the collection URL. But since we define it on the model, on the collection, we don't have to define it on the model. And down here, we just have the jQuery Ajax call to call the server just down here. We have the call to actually call the server, and it returns the XHR object, which is our Ajax object that we can perform operations on. So this is the Backbone sync function. One other important thing is the method map here, so you can see the actions actually get mapped to the proper Restful verbs as we would expect. And one other thing that I do want to show you, one other thing that we do want to take a look at is the URL function on the model itself. So let's take a look at that. So if we search for URL over here, we'll find the URL function, and it's right here. And what it says basically is what I was just telling you about with the collection. So we'll try to grab the collection's URL unless the model has a root URL here. And then it's going to use that. Another important thing is that it will attach the ID of the actual model if the model is not new. So if you're doing the update, destroy, or read actions on an existing model, it's going to do the proper REST route for that. So that's how that works. Okay, so now that we have that working, let's hook up the destroy and update actions. Let's start with the destroy on the server side, and then we'll do the update. Okay, so the destroy function will be very simple. We're just going to find the ID of the tweet that we want to delete. So let's do that. And we're going to remove that tweet by calling the remove function on the collection itself. And in Mongo, we have something called the object ID, which is a little different than a normal string. It has its own type, and we'll have to use it to actually be able to find the ID of the object we want to delete. So let's do that. And notice that we're using underscore ID because that's how IDs work in Mongo. So let's use this object ID, which we will define in one moment, like so. And we're going to pass it a callback function with an error, callback, param, and a number of records removed. Okay, there we go. So over here, we'll check if there's an error or the number of records removed is not equal to 1. And we'll return a 500 error if that happens. 500, and we'll return a normal error message with a status of 500 and an error message for it. And the reason I'm using this JSON notation for our error messages is just so we can inspect it if we wanted to on the client side, so we can differentiate. Next, we're just going to respond with the ID of the deleted tweet. There we go. So that'll be it. So that's it for our destroy function. So now we just need to define the object ID, and we'll define it back in the databases file. But over here, we're going to require it. Okay, great. So back in the database file, we're going to define the object ID as a Mongolian object ID. And that's going to give us the native type for the object ID from MongoDB. And down here, we're going to export it using the model exports dot object ID equals object ID, like so. Let's just move it up here so it's more clear. So we'll need to do one more thing. If we take a look at what's returned from our tweets index action, we will see that we have this array of bytes. So let's take a look at that really quick here in our browser. So as you can see, we have this array of bytes. To get around that, and so that we can use this ID as part of the Backbone ID that's going to be used in the model that I've shown you in the Backbone source, we're going to do a little bit of a hack, and we're going to define a toJSON method on the object ID just by extending the prototype. And I'm going just to paste this line of code here that will do that. And all it does is, as you can see, we're using the prototype of the object ID to define a toJSON method. And all the toJSON method does is invokes a toString here. And what that will allow us to do is when we return our docs in our tweets controller over here, when we return our docs in here, then it will serialize them to JSON properly. And instead of being an array, so if we stop this and restart our application and reload the page, you'll see that now it's a string. Next, we will need to go back to our client. So back down here below the interpolation line, we'll need to override the default way that Backbone retrieves an ID, because as you saw, the model is returned with an underscore ID, but Backbone expects the property to be called ID when it comes back from the server, so we'll need to override that. And we'll do it just by using this one line of code here. And all this does right here is change the default from an ID property to an underscore ID property, so it's easier to use with a MongoDB database like the one we have. Okay, perfect. So we can save that. And finally, just correct our indentation here a little bit before we fix the client-side code. There we go, beautiful. Now it's all fixed. So now to finish off on our delete functionality, we'll need to down here to call a destroy action on the model and wrap in this remove in a conditional callback. So it's going to look something like this. So we're going to call a destroy on the model. And again, we're going to pass in an object literal with a success callback and an error callback, just like the rest of the Backbone API requires. There we go. And on error, let's just, again, console log the ID of the tweet that it failed to remove. So let's just say console log. So now we can actually test this out in the browser. So let's switch back to the browser, reload the page, and let's try deleting one of those tweets. Great, so it seems to have been removed. So the success function has been called. Let's try deleting this other one and then refreshing the page. Perfect, so it deleted it from the database. So let's just to verify it further, let's go to our tweets. Perfect, so it's not there anymore. Great, so we have the delete functionality working. Next, and all that's left is to do the edit functionality here. So let's do that. Let's start again from the server side. And let's write the update action here, right down here. And we're going to start the same way we started with the destroy, just by grabbing the ID from the params hash. And what the params hash is the part of the URL that you're using in your routes. So when we define over here in our routes file, we define this :id. That's where the params hash is coming from. That's why it's :id. And that's how we can grab it. It's very similar to the way that Rails does things with its params hash. So you should be probably familiar with that already. Okay, so the next thing is we need to find that tweet and we need to update it. And we need to find the params that need to be updated. So same as we did here in the create, we're just gonna grab the params from the body to know the updated attributes for that tweet. So let's do that here. So very similar to the way we did the destroy, we're gonna call tweets.update to pass in the ID of that tweet that we're looking for. So let's pass in that ID here. The second attribute is going to be the params hash. So let's send that in. And one thing we might want to do with the params hash is we would want to remove the ID attribute that it's going to send with it. So we want to just make sure that we cannot change the ID attribute of the tweets model. So to do that, we'll create a new function to sanitize the IDs. So just down here, let's create a sanitize function. And I'll get a tweet _.clone tweet. Okay, so all this does is it removes the ID attribute from the parameters hash. So let's use that here to sanitize our params. And as you see, I'm using underscore here on the server, so I'll have to add it to my project. So I'll need to do npm install underscore -- save to add it to our package. So the next parameter is just a callback, again with the same way that we have the callback for the destroy here. It's just a callback with an error and the number of records that have been changed. So let's do that. Num updated. Let's call it that. And if there's an error or the number of updated ones is not equal to 1, let's return a 500 error and send a little error message. Failed to update. And on success, we're just going to send back the params. So now I'm going back to our client side. So just down here where we set the status, right after we close the content editable tag, we're going to save it again to the database. So same way, we're just going to call a save function, and we're going to pass an empty hash for the attributes that have changed. Another way to do things would be just to inline it and make it a little bit shorter. And let's do it like that this time. So let's assign status to status and save it in the same line. And again, we're going to pass in a hash with 2 callbacks, one for success and one for error. Okay. And the error one. So on success here, we don't really need to do anything. Usually what we would do is if we had a spinner, which we're not going to cover here, we're going to hide that spinner. But in this case, I'm just going to console log a success message. So let's do that. Put this .model. And again, on error, let's just say a very similar message to the delete one. Failed to update the tweet. Okay, so we can save that, and we'll actually have to use self here because success and error have their own scope for the this keyword. So let's do that here. Just up here, let's define self as this. Perfect. And one more thing I forgot is I forgot to require underscore here where I'm using it. So just up here, I'll actually require underscore like so. And just before we test it out, one more quick change that I've noticed that we have a problem with is just over here. We don't need to use the get function because the ID is not an attribute of the model, but we will use it as an .id like so to use the backbone getter for it, which we overwrote again. So that should work. And let's give it a try. So if we change this hello there to something else, so let's do that. Click enter. Great, so it saved our changes here. And if you reload the page, it remains the same. So we've just persisted the changes. We've just added, removed, and edited a database entry. Now you might be asking yourself, what about the show method? Mike, what are you going to do about that? Well, let's take a look at our interface first and figure out what we need to do with it and what it even means. So if you look back at our interface here, we don't really have anything to show, but if you think of how Twitter works and how you can actually view the details of a tweet in a separate view, and that's exactly what we're going to do here. So we're going to add a button here called details, and what the details button is going to do, it's going to redirect us to a new view, and that new view will only display that one tweet. So let's do that first, and then we'll use Backbone to make it look nicer. So let's get started. So we'll first need to modify our template. And if we go back to our index here, we'll just grab this and we'll add a details link here. So let's add it just before the edits. Let's say details edits and delete. Looks good. Let's change that to details. Okay, perfect. Back here in our main.js file, we're going to add details. Click event handler. So here, we're just going to change this to details, like so. Okay. And we need to add a method called details. So just under here, under the edits, let's create a details method. And we'll just leave this as a placeholder for later. So let's just put to do placeholder here. And going back to our template, we're going to change the link here. So back here on the template, we're going to change this link to go to our tweets view, which is going to be tweets / and the ID of the tweet. So we can access it by using underscore ID here. Let's save that and take a look at what we get here in the browser. Let's refresh. And if we hover over it, and let's refresh our browser, and if we inspect it, we will see that we get the ID here. And if we click it right now, nothing will happen because we haven't responded to the action on the server side. So let's do that. Let's respond with something. In the tweets controller action, we will start by doing the same thing we did with the update. So we'll grab the ID from the params, and then we'll use the tweets collection find one method, and we'll pass it the ID again, the same way we passed it here. And we'll also get a callback the exact same way as before, with the first argument any possible errors, and the second argument will be the actual tweet if one is found. If not, there will be undefined or null. So let's check for errors first. So let's say if error will return 500. So let's respond with a 500. And usually errors just mean database errors. And if the tweet is not found, then we'll get a null in the tweet variable itself. So we will use that to give a 404 if the tweet has been deleted or just can't find the tweet. So let's do that. So status, and then let's print out the tweet ID if the tweet is not null. And let's respond with status 404 if it is null. And we'll add an error message that will say that the tweet cannot be found. So let's just do that. Great. And now all that's left is to send that new tweet that we just found. So that's all the changes that we need on the server. Now we can switch to the client. And on the client, we will start by creating a new backbone route. So we'll define a router. Okay, like so. And we'll define two routes in there. One for the root, so that'll be our index action on, and that's not to be confused with the index action on the server. This is going to be the index action on the client that we'll just define in 1 second. And the second one will be to display the tweet details. So we'll call it a show action here. And now we need to define those two methods. So let's define index first as a function. And let's leave it blank for now. And let's define show as a function and leave that blank, providing an ID to it. So the way that routes work in Backbone is you define your routes inside the router like so, like strings, and it has a very similar syntax to the routes you are familiar from the server side, from Rails, and so on. So the colon means it's a parameter, and the parameter gets passed to the handler function, which is the second argument in this, which is the value in this hash here. And what we'll normally do here is we will hide and show our views inside the router. So we'll just use the router to control which views are displayed when. So we'll do that here as well. But one thing we need to do before that is we need to actually create a new view for our tweet details. So let's grab the code for that. So I'll copy and paste the code and I'll explain what it is. Perfect. So all this is very simple code for the view. So we have our initializer, which initializes a template, and it expects an element called tweet details, which we still need to create. It has a back button, which just goes to the back action in Backbone. Router.navigate will change the URL that is used in the browser, and it will navigate to our root URL in this case. And what the second parameter does is it ensures the route handler that we define down here actually gets executed when we navigate. So when we click the back button, the index router handler here will be invoked, and the proper views will be shown and hidden. The other thing in this code that you just pasted is the show and hide actions, which we'll use to show and hide our views. And then we have the typical render method, which we've looked at before with our other views. Next, we will need to also include show and hide methods in the index view. So that's going to be the tweets view here. So let's do that. So we'll just copy and paste that in here. And we'll just modify this here because we don't need to render a new model like we did here. So if you notice, I am changing the model on the show action for the tweet details view because every time I'll be viewing a different tweet. Okay, great. So now we can actually write in the content of our two handler functions here. So we're going to use a tweet details view, and we're going to hide it here because this is the index action, and we want to show the tweets view. Down here we'd want to do just the opposite, so let's copy this and just do the exact opposite. So we want to show our tweet details view, and we want to pass in the model itself. But first we have to get the model because we only have the ID and not the model. So to get the model, we will instantiate a new tweet model and use the show action that you just defined on the server side to fetch that model. So we'll use the model fetch action, and we'll define success and error callbacks again, just the same way we did when we were saving. Now we can grab this and put it in the success and pass in the model, like so. And we want to hide the tweets view. And on an error, we're just going to console log an error. Now, before we can use the router, we have to instantiate a new router. So we're going to call it router with the lowercase r, and we're just going to instantiate it here. And one more thing we need to do before the router will actually work is we need to call the backbone history start to start tracking changes to the browser URL. To start tracking changes to the URL in the browser. So let's do it just down here where we define our views. So we're going to call backbone.start, like so. And we're just going to pass in an empty hash right now of attributes. And we want to change this app view to be our tweets view. And we'll want to also extend the tweet details view. So let's create the tweet details view. And let's make sure it's defined up above. And it is. So we define our two views here already. And all that's left is in our index page is to define the new container for our tweet details view. So let's copy and paste this here. So tweet details. And down here we need to define a template for it, and which is going to be very similar to the template we use here. So we can copy that. Okay, and we'll just modify it a little bit by saying it's the tweet details template. And we'll need to, and we want to reverse the order of the author and the status. We want the status to be displayed in big letters. So we will change that here to an H2. And we'll paste in the author and we'll change that to an H4, like so. And down here, we don't need these buttons anymore, but we'll leave one of them, and that will be our back button. So let's call this back. And the last thing we need to do before we can test this out is to add some CSS to our new view. So I'm just going to paste in that code here. And it's pretty straightforward. We're just going to say that initially it will be display none, so the tweet details will not be displayed, it will be position absolute, and it will cover the entire page when it is displayed. Excellent, so let's give it a try and see what it looks like in our browser here. So let's refresh the page and try it out. So we're just going to click the details button, and voila, it brings us to a new view. And as you can see, it changed up here to use the hash fragment called tweets, and we can use the back button and it'll bring us back to the index action. So it works great. And the reason the hash character is used as part of the URL is just for older browsers that don't support the new HTML5 push history API, where you can push new URLs into the browser without refreshing the page. So this is just a way for older browsers to also be able to change the URL without refreshing the page. Luckily, Backbone provides us an easy way to switch to using the history API if we wanted to in HTML5 enabled browsers. So let's do that and let's see what it looks like. So that'll be just as simple as going back to our main.js. And here where we declare our start, all we need to do is add push state true, and that'll use the HTML5 history API if it's available. Otherwise, we'll fall back to using the hash in older browsers like IE8. Let's take a look at what that might look like in our browser. Let's get rid of this hash. And if we click on details now, voila, we go to the route just as we would with a normal page refresh. So it all seems to work quite well. The only caveat to this approach is that if we try to refresh the page, we will get a JSON response back. And that's because, if you remember, the way we wrote our show controller for the tweet show action is returning a JSON object. So one way to get around this is to use a special route for all the API calls that expect JSON back. Instead of using the tweets in Backbone, we can use API/tweets like so. And that will prevent us from ever running into this problem where when we refresh the page, we return a JSON object back. The other way to do this is to use a .json and at the end of your URLs to distinguish between a JSON response and an HTML response in your controller, and you'll need to check that. The problem with this approach is that Backbone does not support it out of the box. So to get that to work, you'll need to override your Backbone sync and the URL functions for the model and possibly the collections as well. And that's usually more trouble than it's worth. So I suggest going with the /API approach if you can, although it produces some code duplications at times. It's just a lot cleaner and less error prone. So that's it for this tutorial. I hope you've enjoyed it and learned something important. So that's it for this tutorial. I hope you've enjoyed it and learned something you consider useful. Thank you all for watching, and sorry again for the long wait. And just before we go, one thing that I forgot to mention that you may run into is that in order to get the fetch function to work on the model here, where we did our router, actually define the URL root. The new model that we create here is not part of any collection. Not find the URL using the collection, therefore it must be defined on the model itself. So I defined it up here like so. And this is all I have, so I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and learned something useful from it. Any questions, feel free to tweet at me at Igdive. Code will be posted on GitHub. Get it there. Again, for the long-awaited part 2, I was quite busy with my own startup, Zero Idle. 0 is in the number 0. I help event organizers find space for their events. So if you're interested in that, go ahead to zeroidle.com. Again, 0 is in the number 0. And check us out. I'll see you next time.